Hello, and welcome to our sanctuary of stories. Find a comfortable position, whether you are nestled in your bed or resting in a quiet chair. Allow your body to grow heavy and your breathing to deepen. Tonight, we travel to a place where the world is soft at the edges. Where mystery is not a thing to be feared, but a gentle melody to be heard. Let the day's worries drift away like leaves on a slow-moving stream. We are about to begin our journey. If you find comfort in these tales and wish to join us for more peaceful nights, please consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue to create these havens of rest for you. Now, close your eyes, relax. On the furthest edge of a forgotten coastline, nestled between the soft green shoulders of rolling hills and the vast gray sigh of the North Sea, lay the village of Etheria. It was a place woven from stone, salt, and silence. The cottages were built from smooth, sea-worn pebbles and dark, sturdy timber, their roofs a mosaic of slate that glistened like a dragon's scales after a rain. Winding cobbled lanes, too narrow for anything more modern than a bicycle or a handcart, threaded their way between the houses, each turn revealing a new glimpse of the harbor, where fishing boats with names like Seadrifter and Hope's Folly bobbed patiently on the tide. Time in Etheria did not march forward, it meandered. It was a current, not a clock, and the villagers moved with its gentle, predictable rhythm. They were people of the sea and the soil, their faces etched with the stories of sun and wind, their hands calloused from mending nets and tending gardens. Living in the smallest of these cottages, the one closest to the cliff path, was a woman named Alara. She was not born of Etheria, but the village had claimed her as its own over the decades she had called it home. She was the town's archivist, a custodian of its brittle, ink-faded history. Her domain was a quiet, dusty room at the back of the small village hall, a space that smelled perpetually of old paper, leather bindings, and a faint, sweet hint of decay that was more comforting than sad. Alara's life was as quiet and ordered as the records she kept. Her days were spent in the gentle company of ghosts, the names of sailors lost to storms, the looping signatures on marriage certificates from centuries past, the carefully recorded minutes of council meetings that debated the price of fish or the repair of the harbor wall. She found a profound peace in this work, a sense of connection to the unbroken chain of lives that had unfolded in this very spot. Her evenings were spent in her own cottage, with a book, a cup of chamomile tea, and the company of her cat, a silent, gray shadow named Dust. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the eternal, omnipresent whisper of the sea. But there was another sound in Etheria, one that was so much a part of the village's fabric that most residents no longer noticed it. It was the wind. This was no ordinary wind. It did not simply howl or whistle. On clear, calm nights, when the moon cast a silver path across the water, the wind that drifted in from the sea and through the narrow lanes of Etheria seemed to carry something within it. It was a sound like a sigh, a soft, polyphonic murmur that was almost, but not quite, language. The old-timers had a name for it. They called it the Anemoi Enoma, the wind of names. Legend said that it was the sea breathing back the names of all those it had held. A gentle litany of souls who were gone, but not forgotten. It was a comforting thought. A piece of folklore as ingrained in the village as the moss on the north side of the church tower. Most people heard it simply as the wind, the unique acoustic of the cliffs and coves shaping its sound. But Alara, a woman attuned to the whispers of the past, was beginning to hear something more. She hadn't sought it out, but in the deep quiet of her life, her senses had become honed, sharpened to a finer point than most. In the rustle of the ivy against her windowpane, in the low moan of the air flowing over her chimney pot, she sometimes felt the distinct shape of a sound, a fleeting, melodic syllable that vanished the moment she tried to focus on it. It was a mystery, but a gentle one, as soft and unobtrusive as the evening mist that rolled in to blanket the village in a soft, quiet embrace. The Etheria Village Archive was Alara's sanctuary. It was a single, long room with a high, vaulted ceiling from which a few motes of dust perpetually danced in the slanted afternoon light. The walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with shelves of dark, heavy oak, sagging slightly under the weight of centuries. Here rested the village's collective memory, bound in leather and tied with faded ribbon. There were ship's logs with entries written in a steady, confident hand that grew shaky and desperate as the final pages detailed a losing battle with a storm. There were parish records, their pages as thin and delicate as a moth's wing, listing the baptisms, marriages, and burials that marked the beginning, middle, and end of every life lived within Etheria's embrace. There were bundles of personal letters, their ink turned a sepia brown, filled with mundane news of daily life that, through the passage of time, had become profoundly precious. Alara knew the location of every document by heart. She could navigate the shelves in the dark, her fingers finding the familiar spine of the 18th century census or the smooth cover of the Women's Institute meeting notes from 1922. Her work was a form of gentle archaeology. She wasn't digging for treasure, but for truth, for the small, human details that gave flesh and bone to the names in the ledgers. One afternoon, she was working on conserving a collection of letters from a fisherman named Thomas to his wife, Eleanor, written in the late 1800s while he was away on a long whaling voyage. His words were simple, his spelling often phonetic, but his love for his wife and his longing for home were so palpable they seemed to rise from the very paper. He wrote of the terrifying beauty of icebergs, the back-breaking work, the camaraderie of the crew, and in every letter, he ended with the same line, "Keep the light on for me. My Eleanor, I am always sailing home to you." Alara found the record of his ship, the North Star. It had been lost with all hands in a squall off the coast of Greenland. Eleanor never remarried. She kept a lamp lit in her window every night until the day she died. 30 years later, as Alara carefully placed a sheet of archival tissue between the delicate pages, a gust of wind rattled the tall, arched window of the archive, a sound like a long, slow exhalation, and in that sound, for a fleeting moment, she heard it again. It was clearer this time, a soft chorus of sound that seemed to coalesce around two distinct, melodic notes, though Moss, Eleanor. It was so subtle, so brief, that she instantly doubted herself. It was merely the wind, she thought, her own mind playing tricks on her, projecting the names she had just been reading onto the random sound. And yet, the feeling it left behind was one of profound and gentle sadness. A beautiful melancholy that seemed to settle in the air around her. She looked out the window, across the green churchyard to the slate-gray sea beyond. The wind was a constant presence here, a sculptor of trees and a shaper of stones. It bent the hardy gorse bushes on the cliffs into permanent, windswept bows. It carved the sandstone of the headland into fantastic shapes. What if, she mused, it also held onto something less tangible? What if it held onto the echoes of the lives it had touched? The names that had been spoken into it, cried into it, whispered into it over countless generations? It was a fanciful, romantic notion, the kind of thing a poet would write. Not a serious archivist, but the feeling lingered, a quiet question mark in the peaceful certainty of her day. The wind sighed again, and this time, Alara didn't try to dismiss it. She simply listened. Alara's cottage, named Sea Haven by a previous owner, was her fortress against the world. Though a very small and gentle fortress it was. The walls were thick, made of stone and plaster, which kept it cool in the rare summer heat and cozy during the long, damp winters. The windows were small and deep-set, each one a perfectly framed painting of the sea or the rambling garden she tended with patient care. The inside was filled with the comfortable clutter of a life well lived in solitude. Books overflowed from shelves and were stacked in neat piles on the floor. A worn velvet armchair was pulled up close to the stone hearth, its arms smoothed by years of use. Woven blankets were draped over every surface, and the air was always filled with the scent of drying herbs, lavender, rosemary, and mint, that hung in bunches from the low wooden beams. It was a space that felt deeply personal, a reflection of her own quiet and contemplative nature. One evening, a week after hearing the names in the archive, Alara sat by her fire, the gray cat, Dust, curled into a perfect circle on her lap. Outside, the weather had turned. A storm was brewing far out at sea, and though it wouldn't reach Etheria with its full force, its harbingers were already arriving. The wind had risen from a whisper to a low, insistent moan. It pressed against the cottage, seeking out every tiny crack and crevice, making the old timbers groan like a ship at sea. The rain came in great, sweeping gusts, lashing against the window panes. This was a different kind of wind. It was not the gentle, sighing breeze of folklore but a raw, powerful force of nature. Yet, even within its wild chorus, Alara found herself listening for something else. She closed her book, set it aside, and gave her full attention to the storm's symphony. She listened past the drumming of the rain and the roar of the surf crashing against the rocks below the cliff. She listened to the high-pitched whistle as the wind tore through the branches of the lone, twisted hawthorn tree in her garden. She listened to the deep, resonant hum it made as it flowed over the roof of her cottage. And beneath it all, woven into the very fabric of the storm's chaos, she began to perceive it again. It was not a clear sound, not a single name, but a multitude. It was like standing in a crowded hall where everyone was speaking at once, their voices blending into a single, incomprehensible river of sound. It was a torrent of syllables, of vowels and consonants, rising and falling with the gusts of wind. There was no menace in it, no sense of threat. Instead, it felt like an immense, collective outpouring of memory, 1,000 stories all trying to be told at once. It was overwhelming, but in a strangely beautiful way. It was the sound of a history far older and vaster than the one she curated in her dusty archives. The names were too many, too fast, too jumbled to be understood. They were simply there, a testament to the sheer number of lives that had passed through this small corner of the world. As the storm raged, Alara did not feel small or frightened. She felt a part of something immense. She pulled a thick woolen blanket tighter around her shoulders, her hand resting on the soft, warm fur of the sleeping cat, and listened to the rain, the sea, and the endless, story-filled wind. The storm passed during the night, leaving the world washed clean and glistening in the pale morning light. The air was fresh and sharp with the smell of wet earth, salt, and ozone. Alara spent her morning in the garden, righting a few overturned pots and gently coaxing her climbing roses back onto their trellis. The sea was calm again, a placid sheet of silver blue stretching to the horizon, its earlier fury just a memory. The day was peaceful, and the busyness of the storm's wind was replaced by the familiar, gentle breeze that was Etheria's constant companion. By the afternoon, Alara was back in the archives, meticulously cataloging a box of old photographs that had recently been discovered in the attic of the church. They were stiff, sepia-toned portraits of stern-faced men with formidable mustaches and women in high-collared dresses, their hair piled in elaborate arrangements. They stared out from the past, their expressions unreadable, their names, in most cases, lost to time. Alara felt a familiar pang of sorrow for these forgotten faces, these lives condensed into a single, anonymous image. That evening, the sky was exceptionally clear. A sliver of a crescent moon hung in the deep indigo sky, and the stars, far from the light pollution of any city, seemed close enough to touch. Alara decided to take a walk along the cliff path before settling in for the night. The path was a narrow ribbon of earth that snaked along the very edge of the land. With the dark, sleeping fields on one side and the sheer drop to the sea on the other. The air was cool and still. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic shush of the waves on the shingle beach below and the soft crunch of her own footsteps on the path. The wind was barely present, just a faint, cool caress against her cheek. It was on this walk, in the profound and absolute quiet of the night, that she heard it. It was different from all the other times. It wasn't a jumble of voices, nor was it a fleeting, half-imagined syllable. It was a single name, spoken with impossible clarity and gentleness. It did not seem to come from any particular direction but materialized directly in the air around her. As if the air itself had decided to speak. The name was Lyriel. It was a beautiful name, melodic and strange. It hung in the air for a moment, as clear as a struck bell, before fading back into the silence. Alara stopped dead on the path, her heart giving a sudden, sharp thump against her ribs. She stood frozen, straining her ears, waiting. A minute passed, then another. The silence returned, deep and unbroken, but the name remained, echoing not in the air, but in her mind. Lyriel. She had never encountered that name before in any of the Etheria records. It was not a local name. It felt ancient, almost mythical, and unlike the other whispers. This one had felt intentional. The others had been like listening to a recording of the past. This had felt like a direct address, a call. It wasn't frightening. The feeling that washed over her was one of immense, poignant longing. It was the sound of a name that desperately wished to be remembered. She slowly turned and walked back toward the warm, welcoming light of her cottage. The strange and beautiful name, a silent, insistent companion on her journey home. The gentle mystery of the wind had just become personal. The name Lyriel took root in Alara's mind. It was there when she woke the next morning, a quiet hum beneath her thoughts. It followed her to the archives, a silent question as she went about her duties. The work that usually brought her such deep contentment now felt different, imbued with a new and specific purpose. The anonymous faces in the old photographs seemed to look at her with a new intensity, as if asking, "Is it me? Am I the one you were looking for?" The rows of names in the ledgers were no longer just historical data, they were a sea of possibilities. And somewhere within them, she felt a certainty that she would find an anchor for this name that had drifted to her from the air. Her search began methodically, with the discipline of a seasoned archivist. She started with the most comprehensive records, the census data for Etheria and the surrounding parishes. Going back as far as the brittle, crumbling pages would allow, she spent hours running her finger down long, spidery columns of handwritten names. She found dozens of Marys, Eleanors, and Annes. She found a Temperance, a Hephzibah, and even a Neptune, born to a particularly creative sea captain's wife. But there was no Lyriel. She moved on to the parish registers, the thick, heavy books that recorded the baptisms, marriages, and burials. She scanned the pages, her eyes blurring from the effort of deciphering the faded, elegant script of long-dead vicars. She learned of babies who lived only a few hours, their names recorded with a heartbreaking brevity. She read of couples who married and had a dozen children, their family trees branching out across the pages like mighty oaks. She saw entire families wiped out by sickness, their names listed one after another in the burial records, a stark testament to the fragility of life. It was a deeply intimate and often sorrowful journey through the town's history. But the name she sought remained elusive. Lyriel was nowhere to be found. Days turned into a week. Alara expanded her search. She went through property deeds, tax records, and the minutes of old council meetings. She even read through the town's collection of school logbooks, hoping to find the name of a student or perhaps a visiting teacher. Nothing. It was as if the person had never existed. A more practical mind would have given up, would have dismissed the whisper on the cliff path as a trick of the wind. A momentary auditory illusion. But Alara could not let it go. The clarity of the name, the feeling of gentle insistence that had accompanied it, felt too real to be a mere fantasy. She began to wonder if she was looking in the wrong way. The archives held the official story of Etheria, the recorded, documented facts, but every town has another history, an unwritten one, that lives in the memories of its people, in its folklore, and in the stories passed down from one generation to the next. Perhaps Lyriel did not exist on paper. Perhaps her story was one that had been entrusted, not to ink, but to the wind. That evening, as she locked the heavy oak door of the archive, she resolved to change her approach. She would put away her ledgers and her magnifying glass. It was time to start listening, not just with her ears, but with her heart. She would seek out the living archives of Etheria, its oldest residents. Etheria's oldest resident was a man named Silas Blackwood. He was 93 years old and had lived his entire life in the same small cottage overlooking the harbor. A house so close to the water that on the highest tides, the sea spray would mist its front windows. Silas had been a fisherman, like his father and his grandfather before him. Though he no longer went out with the boats, he spent his days sitting on a wooden bench in front of his cottage, mending nets with his gnarled, arthritic fingers. His eyes, the pale, faded blue of a winter sky, fixed on the horizon. He was a man of few words, but his memory was a vast, deep ocean, filled with the stories and secrets of the village. Alara found him there the next afternoon, the scent of tar and brine clinging to the air around him. She brought him a small jar of her homemade blackberry jam, a traditional offering of respect. He accepted it with a slow, grateful nod and gestured for her to sit beside him. For a while, they sat in a comfortable silence, watching the gulls wheel and cry overhead. Alara knew that with Silas, one could not rush. Questions had to be approached circuitously, like a boat navigating a tricky channel. She asked him about the fishing, about the weather, about his garden. He answered in short, gravelly sentences, his voice rough from a lifetime of sea air. Finally, when the moment felt right, she broached the subject that had brought her there. "Silas," she said softly, "I'm trying to find information about someone who may have lived here a long time ago. The name is Lyriel." Silas stopped his work, his hands becoming still over the half-mended net in his lap. He stared out at the sea, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was silent for so long that Alara began to think he hadn't heard her or had no answer. Then, he spoke. "Lyriel," he murmured, testing the name on his tongue. "No, not a name I know. Not a village name." Alara's heart sank a little. "But," he continued, turning to look at her, his pale eyes surprisingly sharp, "it has a ring to it, a sound, like the old stories." He squinted, dredging up a memory from the deepest part of his mind. "My grandmother, she used to tell me tales. Not of Lyriel, but she spoke of the painter girl, the one who lived in the old Moreau cottage up on the headland. The one that's been empty for 100 years. Alara's interest was instantly piqued. The Moreau cottage, she knew the place. It stood isolated on the far side of the bay, a ruin of gray stone. Its roof long since collapsed, its windows like empty eye sockets staring out to sea. It was a place children dared each other to go near on Halloween. A place whispered to be haunted, not by anything malevolent, but by a deep and abiding sadness. "The Moreau cottage?" she prompted gently. "What about the painter girl?" Silas began to work the shuttle through the net again, his movements slow and rhythmic. "Grandma said she wasn't from here. Came with her family. The Moreaus, they were different, kept to themselves. And the girl, she was always alone. Always wandering the cliffs with her paints and her easel, trying to paint the wind. My grandma used to say." She said the girl had a strange, foreign-sounding name, A beautiful name, but she couldn't ever recall it. He paused, his gaze distant. Then one day, the whole family was just gone. Packed up and left. No one knew why. The girl left all her things behind. They said, it was a mystery, a sad one. He fell silent again. The story finished. Alara's mind was racing. A reclusive family. A girl who tried to paint the wind. A strange, beautiful, forgotten name. It was not proof, but it was a thread. The first real thread she had been able to grasp. She thanked Silas for his time and his story and left him to his nets and his memories. Her steps now leading her in a new direction, towards the lonely, ruined cottage on the headland. The walk to the old Moreau cottage was a journey away from the gentle, domestic embrace of the village and into a wilder, more untamed landscape. The path grew narrower and more rugged, winding its way through thickets of gorse with their brilliant yellow flowers and sharp, dark spines. The air grew thick with the scent of wild thyme, crushed underfoot, and the ever-present, briny tang of the sea. The cottage itself appeared suddenly as she rounded a rocky outcrop. It was even more desolate up close than it looked from the village. The gray stone walls were still standing, a testament to the skill of the long-dead masons who had built them. But they were scarred with dark patches of lichen and shrouded in a thick mantle of ivy. The roof was gone entirely, leaving the interior open to the sky. The window frames were empty, and the front door hung from a single, rusted hinge, creaking a mournful protest with every push of the wind. Alara hesitated at the threshold. The place had a powerful atmosphere, a palpable sense of abandonment and arrested time. It did not feel menacing, but it was profoundly melancholic. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The floor was a carpet of moss and weeds. A small, resilient sapling grew defiantly in the center of what must have been the main living area. A great stone hearth dominated one wall, its chimney choked with ivy. The stones blackened from 1,000 long extinguished fires. She could almost imagine a family huddled here, listening to the wind howl outside. She moved through the few small, ruined rooms, her footsteps silent on the soft earth. In one corner, she found a pile of rusted metal that might once have been a bed frame. In another, shards of a blue and white patterned plate lay half buried in the dirt. These were the last, faint echoes of the life that had once filled this space. She was drawn to the window that looked directly out to sea. The view was breathtakingly beautiful and stark. It was a panorama of endless gray water meeting an endless gray sky. A canvas of infinite, subtle shades. This must have been her window, Alara thought. The window of the painter girl. This is what she would have seen every morning. What she would have studied with an artist's intense gaze. As if on cue, the wind picked up, flowing in through the empty window frame. It swirled around the small, ruined room, rustling the ivy on the walls. And as it did, Alara heard the name again. Lyriel. It was quieter this time. More of a sigh than a call. But it was unmistakably present. It was a whisper that belonged to this place. It was the sound of a memory that had soaked into the very stones of the cottage. She stood there for a long time. Not as an archivist, but as a listener, a witness. She felt a growing sense of connection to this unknown girl. This Lyriel who had loved this wild view enough to try and capture its soul on canvas. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that she was in the right place. The story was here, buried under the moss and the silence, waiting to be unearthed. The wind sighed the name again, a soft encouragement, and Alara knew her search was far from over. Driven by her experience at the cottage, Alara returned to the archives with a renewed sense of purpose. She now had a family name, Moreau, and a specific location. This was concrete information, the kind of data she knew how to work with. She pulled out the large, heavy volumes of property deeds and land registry records, her fingers tracing the maps of the parish as they changed over the decades. It didn't take her long to find it. The property on the headland, officially designated Headland Croft, had been sold to a Mr. Alistair Moreau in the spring of 1888. The records showed he had purchased the cottage and the surrounding 10 acres of land from the estate of a deceased sheep farmer. The Moreau family had owned it for only 4 years. In the autumn of 1892, the property was sold again, this time to a land speculator from the city, who had apparently let it fall into the ruin it was today. 4 years. It was such a brief period of time, a fleeting moment in the village's long history. Alara searched for more records linked to the Moreau name. She checked the tax ledgers for those 4 years. Alistair Moreau was listed, his taxes paid promptly each year. She checked the register of local businesses. Nothing. She checked the harbor master's logs. No boat was registered to them. It confirmed what Silas had said. They were outsiders. A family who had arrived, lived quietly and apart for a short time, and then vanished, leaving almost no trace in the official records. But Alara was a thorough archivist. She knew that sometimes the most important information was found in the margins. In the ancillary documents, she began to look through the general records from that specific period. And that was when she discovered the gap. In the winter of 1903, a fire had broken out in the old town hall. It had been a devastating event, and though the main structure was saved, the room that had served as the records office had been badly damaged. Many documents were lost entirely, turned to ash. Others were severely damaged by smoke and water. A note, written in the neat, precise hand of her predecessor, detailed the extent of the loss. Among the documents destroyed beyond recovery were a significant portion of the parish's civil registration records, the detailed birth and death certificates, from the years 1885 to 1895. A cold knot of disappointment formed in Alara's stomach. The very decade the Moreaus had lived in Etheria, if Liriel had been born there, or if anyone in the family had died during their stay, the primary record would be gone forever. It was a dead end. A blank space where a story should have been. She sat back in her chair. The scent of old paper and dust thick in the air. The wind rattled the window. A low, mournful sound. It felt, for the first time, like a taunt. It had given her a name. A beautiful, ethereal clue. But the path to uncovering the story behind it was proving to be fraught with missing pieces and historical dead ends. It seemed that Liriel Moreau, if that was indeed her name, was destined to remain a ghost. A whisper on the wind with no substance. No history. Alara felt a wave of frustration and sadness wash over her. It wasn't just an archival puzzle anymore, it felt like a duty. A promise she had made to the gentle voice on the cliff path. To fail felt like a betrayal. She closed her eyes, picturing the ruined cottage, the empty window looking out at the endless sea. She had to believe that something had survived. A story as potent as this one couldn't simply vanish without a trace. Somewhere, in some forgotten corner, there had to be another piece of the puzzle. She just had to figure out where to look. Days passed. Alara felt stuck, her investigation stalled by the burnt records. She went through the motions of her work, but her mind was elsewhere, constantly turning over the few facts she had. The Moreau family, the cottage, the painter girl, the missing decade of records. It was a frustratingly incomplete puzzle. One rainy afternoon, driven by a need to do something, anything, she decided to tackle a task she had been putting off for months. Sorting through a crate of uncatalogued documents that had been donated to the archive by the descendants of Dr. Alistair Finch, who had been Etheria's doctor for over 50 years at the turn of the 20th century. The crate was a jumble of old medical textbooks, financial ledgers, and personal correspondence. It was tedious work, and Alara held out little hope of finding anything relevant. Near the bottom of the crate, however, she found something different. It was a small, black, leather-bound book, its cover warped and stiff with age. It was not a medical log, but a personal diary. The first entry was dated January 1st, 1890. Alara's breath caught in her throat. This was the right time period. With hands that trembled slightly, she opened the diary. Dr. Finch's handwriting was small and cramped, filled with the abbreviations and hurried notes of a busy man. Much of it was mundane. Accounts of his visits, complaints about the weather, notes on his garden. But Alara read every word, searching for any mention of the family on the headland. She read for hours. The only sound in the archive, the soft rustle of the turning pages and the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. And then she found it. An entry from May 1891. Called out to the headland croft today. It began, the Moreau family, a strange, solitary bunch. The father, a stern, quiet man. The mother, a nervous creature with haunted eyes. It was the daughter I was there to see. Alara leaned closer, her heart pounding. She is a young woman, perhaps 17 or 18. They call it a summer fever. But I find no sign of it. She is pale and thin, but her eyes burn with a strange intensity. I believe her ailment is not of the body, but of the spirit, a deep, artistic melancholy. She spends all her days out on the cliffs, painting. Her hands were stained with cerulean blue and cadmium yellow. She barely spoke a word to me, simply stared out the window at the sea as if I wasn't there. I prescribed rest and a tonic, but I doubt it will do much good. Her malady is a sensitivity to the world that no medicine of mine can cure. A difficult case. They did not give me her name, referring to her only as our daughter. Alara read the passage 3 times. It was a stunning piece of the puzzle, a vivid snapshot of the girl she had been searching for. A painter, prone to melancholy, with an intense spirit. It matched Silas's grandmother's story perfectly. The doctor had seen her, spoken to her, been in the same room with her, but he hadn't recorded her name. The frustration was immense, but it was overshadowed by a surge of excitement. This was real. She was real. Lyriel was not a figment of her imagination. She had lived and breathed in that ruined cottage. She had felt the same wind, looked out at the same sea. The diary entry ended on a poignant note. I feel a great pity for the girl. She seems trapped, not by her illness, but by the wild beauty she so desperately tries to capture. It is a lonely calling. Alara closed the diary gently, a feeling of deep empathy for the unknown painter girl swelling in her chest. The diary hadn't given her a name, but it had given her something just as precious, a glimpse into a soul. There was one last person in Etheria who might hold a piece of the story. Her name was Agnes Gable, a woman in her late 80s who was the self-appointed curator of the Etheria History Society. A grand name for a single, cluttered room above the small village shop. Mrs. Gable was a formidable woman, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a memory that was as famous as it was precise. She was the village's living archive, her mind a repository of stories, gossip, and genealogies that went back generations. Alara knew that if anyone had heard a story about the Moreaus that had been passed down through family lore, it would be her. She found Mrs. Gable in her small museum, carefully dusting a glass case containing a collection of clay pipes found in the harbor mud. The room smelled of beeswax and dried flowers. Alara, armed with her new information from the doctor's diary, explained her search. She told Mrs. Gable about the whisper on the wind, the name Lyriel, the Moreau family, the painter girl, and the frustrating lack of official records. Mrs. Gable listened intently, her head tilted to one side, a small, thoughtful smile playing on her lips. When Alara had finished, the old woman was silent for a moment, looking at a faded photograph on the wall of a group of village women from the 1890s. The Moreaus, she said, her voice soft and clear. Yes, I remember my grandmother talking about them. She was a girl then. She called them the sea gazers because they never seemed to look at the village, only ever out at the water. She turned back to Alara. My grandmother was fascinated by the daughter. She said she was like someone from a fairy tale, with long, dark hair and eyes the color of the deep sea. She said the girl was a genius with a paintbrush, that she could paint the light on the water so it looked real enough to touch. A thrill went through Alara. This was it. This was the connection she had been hoping for. Did your grandmother ever know her name? Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Gable shook her head slowly. No, I don't think anyone ever did. They were so private, but my grandmother told me a story. After the family left so suddenly, people were curious. The cottage was left unlocked, as if they meant to come back. A few of the village women went up there. They said the house was bare, except for the girl's room. That room was filled with paintings, canvases stacked against the wall, all of them of the sea and the sky, and there was a large, wooden sea chest at the foot of her bed. Her eyes held Alara's. The story goes that the chest was locked, and no one ever found the key. The girl's father came back, a week later, with a horse and cart. He didn't speak to anyone. He went into the house and took only one thing, the locked sea chest. He loaded it onto the cart and left, and no one from that family was ever seen in Etheria again. A locked sea chest, a father who returned only for that one item. What had been inside it? Alara wondered. More paintings? Or something more personal? It's just a story, of course. Mrs. Gable added, a piece of village gossip. More than 100 years old. But Alara knew it was more than that. It was the next step. The sea chest was the heart of the mystery. The wind had given her a name. The archives and the villagers had given her a story. But the sea chest, she felt with a sudden, bone-deep certainty, held the truth. The story of the sea chest lit a fire in Alara's imagination. It was the kind of tangible, romantic detail that brought the past vividly to life. A locked chest, taken away in secret. It spoke of precious things, of hidden truths. But it also presented what seemed to be an insurmountable problem. The chest was long gone, taken by Lyrile's father over a century ago. The trail was hopelessly cold. Dejected, Alara thanked Mrs. Gable for her time and her invaluable stories. As she was about to leave the small museum, Mrs. Gable said, "Wait a moment, my dear." She walked over to a large, dark wooden bureau in the corner of the room and opened one of its many small drawers. She rummaged inside for a moment before pulling out a small, tarnished brass key tied to a faded velvet ribbon. My grandmother was one of the women who went into the cottage after the Moreaus left, she said, her eyes twinkling. She was a curious soul. She told me that while the others were looking at the paintings, she noticed something on the floor, half hidden under the bed. It was this key. She believed it was the key to the sea chest. She picked it up, thinking she would give it back to the family if they returned. But they never did, so she kept it. It became a kind of family heirloom. The key to the painter girl's secret, she called it. She pressed the key into Alara's palm. It was surprisingly heavy, its surface cool and smooth against her skin. It was ornate, the head shaped like a coiled serpent. Alara stared at it, speechless. For over 100 years, this key had been sitting in a drawer. Its story passed down, waiting. But the chest is gone, Alara said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and disappointment. What good is the key without the chest? Mrs. Gable smiled a knowing, mysterious smile. Ah, but that's where the story my grandmother told might be slightly wrong. She said the father took the chest, but my grandfather, who was a boy at the time, told a different version. He said he saw Mr. Moreau leave with a cart. Yes, but the cart was carrying canvases, rolled and tied with rope. He always insisted the sea chest was too heavy for one man to lift alone, that it must have been left behind. A wild, improbable hope surged through Alara. You mean, it could still be there? In the cottage? It's a long shot, Mrs. Gable admitted, but the cottage has an attic. A small one, under the eaves. No one has been up there in living memory. The stairs rotted away long ago. If something was hidden up there, it's possible it has remained undisturbed all this time. The idea was electrifying. The ruined cottage, the secret attic, the key in her hand. It felt like the final pages of a novel she had been reading for weeks. There was no question of what she had to do next. Armed with the key, a powerful flashlight, and a sturdy ladder borrowed from the village handyman, Alara and a surprisingly spry Mrs. Gable made their way back to the headland. Back to the ruined cottage that held its secrets so tightly. The wind seemed to sense their purpose, swirling around them, whispering a name that was now filled with a sense of hopeful anticipation. Lyriel. They reached the cottage as the afternoon sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape. Inside the ruin, Mrs. Gable pointed towards a dark, square hole high up on one of the stone walls. The attic hatch. It was covered in cobwebs and looked as if it hadn't been opened in a century. With a combined effort, they maneuvered the heavy wooden ladder into place. Alara, holding the flashlight, was the one to climb. The rungs of the ladder felt solid under her feet. As she ascended, the air grew cooler and smelled of damp stone and ancient dust. Reaching the top, she pushed against the hatch. It was stiff, but with a groan of protesting wood, it swung open into the darkness above. She shone the flashlight into the space. It was a small, low-ceilinged attic, filled with the ghostly shapes of things shrouded in a thick, gray blanket of dust and cobwebs. It was a time capsule, a space that had been sealed against the world. Alara pulled herself up into the attic, her feet landing softly on the dusty floorboards. The air was thick and still, the silence absolute, and there, against the far wall, half hidden behind a stack of rotting wooden crates, was a large, dark shape, a sea chest. It was made of a dark, heavy wood, bound with straps of blackened iron. It was exactly as Mrs. Gable's grandmother had described it. Alara's heart was hammering against her ribs. She moved towards it, her flashlight beam cutting a path through the darkness. The chest was immense, and looked incredibly heavy. On the front was a large, ornate lock, the metal a dull, tarnished brass. With a trembling hand, Alara took the serpent-headed key from her pocket. She knelt before the chest and slid the key into the lock. It was a perfect fit. For a moment, she hesitated, a profound sense of reverence for the moment washing over her. She was about to intrude on a life, to open a secret that had been kept for more than 100 years. She took a deep breath, said the name, Lyriel, softly into the dusty air, and turned the key. There was a loud, grating click that echoed in the silent attic. The lock had opened. Slowly, reverently, she lifted the heavy lid. A faint, sweet scent rose from within, the smell of dried lavender, old paper, and oil paint. The chest was not filled with gold or jewels. It was filled with a life. On top lay several sketchbooks, their pages filled with quick, beautiful drawings of the sea, the cliffs, the birds, the changing light. Beneath them were bundles of letters, tied with faded blue ribbon, and under the letters, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, were several small, finished paintings on wooden boards. They were stunning. They captured the wild, melancholic beauty of the Etheria coastline with a skill and an emotional depth that took Alara's breath away. But it was the last item, at the very bottom of the chest. That was the greatest treasure. It was a small, leather-bound journal. Alara opened it to the first page. Written in a flowing, elegant hand was a single sentence. "My name is Lyriel Moreau, and I will paint the soul of the wind." She had found her. She had found Lyriel, in the quiet, dusty attic, with the last rays of the sun slanting through the cracks in the walls. Alara began to read the story of the girl who had been lost to time. Her story finally ready to be told. Alara sat on the floor of the dusty attic, the journal open in her lap, and read. Mrs. Gable waited patiently at the foot of the ladder below, respecting the sanctity of the moment. Lyriel's words, written in a confident, artistic script, flowed across the pages, painting a picture of her life more vivid than any of her canvases. She was not a sad, tragic figure, as village legend had painted her. She was brilliant, passionate, and fiercely observant. She wrote of her family, a stern, protective father who did not understand her art but loved her deeply, and a quiet, anxious mother who feared the power of the sea that so captivated her daughter. They had moved to Etheria for her mother's health, hoping the sea air would bring her peace. For Liriel, it was a move into paradise. She fell in love with the raw, untamed beauty of the coastline. She felt a kinship with its wildness, its constant motion, its changing moods. She wrote about her art not as a hobby, but as a compulsion, a need as fundamental as breathing. People here think I am strange. One entry read, "They see me on the cliffs in all weather, and they whisper. They do not understand that I am not just looking at the sea. I am listening to it. It tells stories. The wind that comes off the water. It is not empty. It feels full of voices, of names and memories. I do not know what they are, but I try to paint the feeling of them. I try to paint the sound of the wind." Alara felt a shiver run down her spine. Liriel had heard it too. She had been listening, just as Alara was. The journal revealed the reason for their sudden departure. Liriel had secretly sent a portfolio of her work to a prestigious art school in Paris. To her astonishment, and her father's great consternation, she had been accepted with a full scholarship. It was an opportunity she could not refuse. The final entries were filled with a mixture of excitement for her future and a deep, poignant sorrow at leaving the place she had come to love. "I will leave Etheria," she wrote on the last page, "but its soul will never leave me. I will carry the sound of its sea and the memory of its wind with me always. I am leaving this chest behind. It holds my beginnings, my Etheria heart. Perhaps one day, I will come back for it, or perhaps it will wait here. A secret for the stones and the sea to keep." There was no record of what happened to her after she left for Paris. She had not returned, and her story in Etheria had simply ended, fading into whispered legend. She hadn't died tragically, she had simply moved on, her life unfolding elsewhere, leaving her youthful passion locked away in an attic. Alara gently closed the journal. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace and completion. The wind hadn't been a ghost's cry. It had been a memory's plea, a desire for a vibrant, passionate life not to be entirely erased from the place that had shaped it. Liriel's story hadn't needed a rescuer, it had just needed a listener. And now, it had found one. Carefully, reverently, Alara and Mrs. Gable transported the contents of the sea chest from the ruined cottage back to the village. They carried the sketchbooks, the letters, the paintings, and the journal as if they were sacred relics. Back in the warm, bright space of the little museum, they laid everything out on a large table. The story of Liriel Moreau filled the room. The villagers who heard the news began to drift in. Their curiosity piqued. Silas the fisherman came, and he stared for a long time at a small, dramatic painting of a storm-tossed sea. The waves rendered in thick, energetic strokes of white and indigo. "She saw it," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "She saw how it truly is." The other villagers gathered around, looking at the sketches of familiar coves and headlands, seeing their home through the eyes of this gifted stranger from their past. Alara and Mrs. Gable decided that Liriel's work deserved to be shared. They spent the next week transforming the small museum. They framed the best of the paintings and mounted pages from her sketchbooks. They carefully arranged a display with her journal, open to the first page, and a few of her letters. They didn't create a stuffy, formal exhibit. Instead, they called it Liriel Moreau, an exhibition of whispers. The opening was a quiet, informal affair. The whole village seemed to turn out. They walked through the small room in a respectful silence, looking at the art, reading the excerpts from her journal that Alara had typed up and placed beside the paintings. A connection was forged between the present-day village and this girl from their past. They were no longer just looking at art, they were remembering a person. They were reclaiming a lost piece of their own history. Alara watched them, a feeling of deep satisfaction warming her. Lyriel was no longer just a name on the wind. She was a presence in the village once more. Her passion, her vision, her love for this wild piece of coastline were alive again in the minds and hearts of the people of Etheria. Her story had been integrated back into the collective memory of the town, where it belonged. Later that evening, after the last of the villagers had gone home, Alara stood alone in the quiet museum, the scent of beeswax and old wood mingling with the faint, lingering smell of oil paint from the canvases. She looked at a self-portrait Lyriel had sketched, a quick, charcoal drawing of a young woman with intense, searching eyes. She looked strong, determined, and full of life. Alara smiled. "We heard you," she whispered softly to the portrait. "We remember." That night, Alara did not stay inside her cozy cottage. She pulled on a warm coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and walked back to the cliff path, the place where she had first heard Lyriel's name spoken so clearly. The moon was full, casting a brilliant, shimmering trail of light across the calm surface of the sea. The air was cool and crisp and almost perfectly still. She sat on a smooth, flat rock, the very one Lyriel must have sat on 100 times, and she waited. For a long time, there was only the profound silence of the night, punctuated by the gentle rhythm of the waves below. Then, a breeze began to stir, drifting in from the vast darkness of the sea. It was the softest of winds, a mere exhalation. It moved through the seagrass, making it whisper. It caressed her face, cool and gentle, and it carried its music with it. Alara closed her eyes and listened. She heard the chorus of names, the soft, collective sigh of the past that she had come to know so well. It was a beautiful, melancholic symphony, the sound of lives lived and loves lost, of arrivals and departures, of joy and sorrow, all woven together into the fabric of this place. But something was different. The name, Lyriel, was no longer a solitary, insistent call. It was not a plea rising above the rest. Instead, it was now a part of the whole. She could hear it, a soft, melodic note that had found its place within the larger chorus. It was a sound of peace, of a memory at rest, of a story that had been heard and honored. It was no longer a whisper of longing, but a murmur of belonging. Alara felt a sense of peace so deep it seemed to settle into her very bones. She understood her own place now. She was not just the keeper of the village's paper records, but a custodian of its intangible memories, a listener for the wind of names. Her quiet life had been touched by a gentle, profound magic, and she was richer for it. She would continue her work in the archives, but she would also continue to listen to the wind, ready for the next name that might need to be remembered, the next story that was waiting to be told. She sat there for a long time, on the edge of the world, feeling herself a part of the endless chain of lives that this wind remembered. She was not alone. She was in the gentle company of all the names the wind held, a quiet guardian of the whispers, under the peaceful, watchful eyes of the moon and the stars. And as the gentle breeze continued its ancient, soothing song, she finally felt ready to go home and sleep.